So today the focus of my discussion are the keywords representational and non-representational. Under representational, I'm going to discuss realism, and under non-representational, abstraction and figurative abstraction. The typology that I'm going to represent is not really fixed on all discussions or fine art discussions. Other teachers may use a different classification. In philosophy, representationalism referred to the advocacy of mental images because philosophers believe that the objects that we see in the paintings are the products of the experiences of the painters themselves of viewing the object. So they're translating their stored experience or on memory into visual forms. Now, the same thing if you're going to draw or illustrate or jot down notes of things that we perceive, we're also using our memory and cognition in order to translate the idea or mental images as well into paper or into physical form or marks on paper. It's a long discussion if we are going to inquire into the representational nature of subjects because it will entail inquiring into the nature of reality, which is also inquiring into the nature or the essence of being present in the world. Let us simplify the matter of representationalism by considering it as the the, the domain of the physical object or the domain of familiar objects. Well, non-representationalism is the opposite. We will deal with non-familiar objects such as abstraction and sometimes distorted realities. I added one category, figurative abstraction, in order to accommodate abstractions that have strong link with associated figures such as the body, like the woman in this picture, in this painting, a busker playing the sitar or the ukulele is still familiar. The form is based on our perceived reality. Once we disfigure and then stretch this out to individual forms or just uh, just create pure forms out of this, it will be non-representational or converted to non-representational. But since we still have figure, it belongs to the third category. Now, let me go back to the first one, representational first. I divided the discussion into traditional realism and non-traditional realism. Under traditional realism, these are the typologies: religious, royal, historical realism, mythology, and nude subject matter. The tradition in painting under the Academy of Fine Arts of France was very strict in its conventional representation. Right? I was saying that when you hold exhibit under this Academy of Fine Arts or salon exhibit, the jury will examine the paintings if they're following the conventions. If they are not conservative enough, if these collection of paintings are no longer committing to the realism of the French realism or of the Fine Arts Academy, they will not be included in the exhibition. Napoleon Bonaparte III created a separate exhibition for those artworks that were refused in the half of the 19th century. It was called as the Salon of the Refused or Salon de Refuses. I don't know how to pronounce it in French, but that was the avenue for the public to look at paintings who were not able to get into the exhibition of the mainstream Academy of Fine Arts Salon. If given a chance, their the promise was for these people to establish their own art form. Hopefully, it will it will flourish in the new art community of modernism. The premise was based on creating a realism that is not based on classical elements of mythology and history, but will be based on picking up new subject. The selectivity will revolve around common day-to-day experiences, which were brushed under the rugs in the classical tradition. When we speak of traditional realism, we are talking about glimmering or very fine surface of paintings without impasto or layers, or the one that Pablo Picasso and Vincent van Gogh had used in their painting. That is not the typical of traditional realism. There should be a glimmering quality and a basis to the proportion of real forms. Religious realism had developed in or started to develop in the medieval century, and it was refined in the Baroque period and the Renaissance period. In terms of the visual narrative, Baroque period intensified the story by making the contents of the story more physical than the preceding period of medieval representation, by making specifically the icons as actors theatrically moving or doing the action or traditional, let's say the traditional narrative. As enacted here, Saint Thomas was doubting and was really surprised of the apparition of Christ in front of them. He became the instrument to validate the presence of Christ by guiding his hand, or by Christ guiding his hand into his fresh wound. This addresses the issue in our, or this addresses the matter or the subject of faith and salvation in Christian tradition. In regard to the style of Michelangelo di Caravaggio, he used the bold quality of the contrast between light and dark. Then he saw to it that the figures fill out the canvas, while the background is almost pitch black. That's one thing in order to spotlight the group subject matter or the group portrait. This one is a group portrait of aristocrat family, showing the opulence and wealth, the material wealth of the royal family. Very seldom does a server or worker appear in the royal family portrait. If they will occur in the royal family portrait, they will not be accommodated at the strongest area of emphasis in the painting. They will not be included in the center of gravity. They will be pushed to the sides, for instance, or will remain a person peeking over a window or from a door. Traditional realism is also fond of history. The paintings would account the significant event that is transformative of the society. For example, the setting into writing, or the formalizing of the independence of a country or of a state, for instance, declaration of the independence. The whole where the document will be signed will be depicted, and then these key figures will also be part of the representation, not only the signing of the document. In the absence of photography, this was how the community documented important events. If we replace all of these icons here in Rembrandt's Van Rijn, The Night Watch, with peasants and the working class, the theme will be shifted significantly into an uprising theme, showing the discontented workers and the outcast laborers. Social realism is a common theme in the modern century, when artists like Gustave Courbet had 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 seen for an opening in art where people become more interested in the dynamics of the poor and the middle class and the proletariat. If people did not embrace this, I think a social realism will not flourish as a kind of modern realism. Still on the Fine Arts Academy or Academy of Fine Arts, the the using of the utility of the body as an aesthetic form, a ready-made aesthetic form, is the the staple kind of aesthetic representation of the jury in the Academy of Fine Arts because it's classical. No question about its beauty, its proportion when it is based on classical antiquity. But if you're going to use Gustave Courbet's and Monet's interpretation of the body, that would be an entirely radical approach or redesigning of the beauty of the nude form, which was done here by Edouard Manet on Olympia. His proportion is not that perfect, and his body volume almost looked like a paper, although the whiteness of the flesh is still manifested and consistent with the classical representation of the flesh. However, it's not as glimmering, it's not as fine or refined compared to the classical antiquity and the one sanctioned by the Academy of Fine Arts. Olympia refers to a common name of concubine or harlot, prostitute, that made this more of an object of derision in the public. The salon exhibit only happens once a year in running from 17th to the 20th century and onwards. Now, during the 19th century, that was the most controversial period because, again, of the presence of Edvard Monet and Gustave Courbet, Jean-Francois Mollet, and other painters who radicalized their approach and defined their own kind of realism. They are now burgeoning and and producing a more explosive movement that will not be based on dictates of higher taste in art. They accommodated lower taste in art, but eventually that is just a derogatory term as a reference for a radical approach. For example, disfigured people is not really staple for realism. Distortion is almost like abstraction, but it is not yet totally abstraction. And it was used as a kind of symbolic mechanism to represent the distorted reality or the victimized the victimized condition of the lower class or the underprivileged class in the society, similar to these commuters who are workers separated in a carriage or a coach, while in front of the train are the aristocrats. At the rear portion of the train are the workers, and sometimes their coach are open so they can inhale dust. There's no good accommodation for the poor class in the 19th century, but they were overworked with very, very low wages. In the Industrial Revolution, uh, the laboring class was actually the fuel of the economy. However, they were not treated equally with with respect to compensation. Painting is an essentially concrete art according to Gustave Courbet, but he did not explain furthermore what he meant by a representation of real and a representation of existing things. He left the art critics and the public to interpret that on their own. And the most common interpretation is Gustave Courbet wants reality to be transparent, then reality should unfold even if it is dark, or even if it is imperfect, the body should not be expunged because something is imperfect of the body. I think he shared a little bit the philosophy of the Roman painters when they did not completely borrow the idealism of the Greeks. They created their naturalism. Realism actually is a very old idea and ideology even in painting. The Romans, remember, had picked up the faces of their emperor in their imperfect, okay, embodiment with scars and crooked noses because this was how they appear in reality. That was not permitted in the classical Greece. For instance, the grim reality and the very cyclical nature of labor that made these people anonymous and remove their individuality is part of the social realism factor of Gustave Courbet. He did not glorify the workers in terms of the labor that they produce, but he tried to he tried to expose the exploitation of the body and the removal of the individual from himself. In contrast with Jean-Francois Millet's interpretation, he created an exaltation of the seed grower or the sower. While he's spreading seeds, he's more he's more of a confident figure with his face to the audience compared to the workers in Gustave Courbet's Stonebreakers. Their backs are towards the audience, not showing their faces, which is symbolic of their anonymity and their facelessness in this area of life. They're weary, they're tired, exhausted, but they do not have any options for social mobility. Another type of labor is urban labor. This old person who is selling goods using a cart is flanked by two persons who are obviously in a better social standing. The idea contrast here is effective. While we see that this man is laboring by pushing the cart, the two are lighter in terms of their going about. The kid is going to school while the man is biking, symbolizing more speed compared to this man and to compared to this mobile vendor. Fred Gallen entitled this as the rolling store. He created two premises here: the premise of hope and the premise of hopelessness. In terms of hopelessness, we can sense that this old man had had grown old attending to his uh, attending to market vending. He has been doing this for years until he is already at this age. Well, on the positive light, the John 3:16 there is more hopeful, or a symbolism of hope. That there's that everybody else will have an equal chance, and everybody else would be the son of God. The rolling store can also be a little parody, an allusion to the rock band, the Rolling Stones. Well, it lightens up our perception of this man as if he's being referred to as the rock star, the Rolling Stones rock star in this image, as he's framed by Fred Gallen. Another very much effective representation of the working class was done by Antipas de Lotavo by interposing the body of an aging laborer against the logo of a transnational company. Now, we are left to our own interpretation of this, and the most valid interpretation is it is still social realist in nature. It creates a space for us to react or to identify with the sentiment of the working class. Like no matter how big a transnational company is, the reality remains that some of them, or at least most of them, based on the news, do not really care about these employees. They care about the legal remedies and legal protection of the company, but in terms of the well-being of these manual laborers, sometimes they overlook, or most often they overlook that area. And it is worsened by the condition of a third world country. No need to rub that on us, but in reference to the third world status of the country, this type of individuals will not have a good chance when they grow old and sick. At that age, they should not be laboring anymore. They should be relaxing and retiring and enjoying social security benefits. But the grim reality is, even if you have a social security benefits, it is not enough to survive yourselves. Even if you're a single individual supporting yourself, you will not be enough. Someday, if I retire as a teacher, my SSS will only be 14,000 or 13,000 a month, and I'm going to live with that. Okay? Igoon. Kung wala investment, pension nga inana kagamay ang paabuton. And I don't know, that amount will be just 1 peso in the future. Industry labor was dramatized by Diego Rivera just after the onset of the Great Depression in America. He was commissioned by Ford, the owner of Ford Motors Company, to paint the metalwork production of his company in a mural art. I think it was done in the Institute of Art of Detroit. So there were 4 panels that he painted on, and this one was the feature, the best, not the best, the common feature of his painting about labor. Specifically here, there's a metalwork production happening. It is being processed there at the back portion as a molten substance, and then it is assembled or molded towards the left, way past the serpentine machinery. And then going downwards on the foreground is the assembly line. If you look at the individual faces of these persons, they're not really happy with their work. Diego Rivera did not really create a grin on the faces of his labor subject matter. They're just concentrating on what they're doing. They're lifeless. Again, this is the factor of labor that had been put to one side, that they are human beings. In the 19th century, remember, which was very much captured by Franz Kafka in Metamorphosis. I want to share with you Metamorphosis, the story of a person, a laborer, who one day found himself transformed into a bug. Then his usual reaction, I mean, our usual reaction when we are transformed into a bug, maybe we will be in a state of shock and we will be so concerned about ourselves. But his immediate reaction was, how is he going to go to the factory? How is he going to commute? How is he going to walk in order to reach his workplace in time without deduction, without being late? That was narrated in the story of how he devalued himself and he dehumanized himself for the sake of labor, because he had no other options. He needed to deny and sacrifice all of his well-being so that he could continually work in a factory that has demanded a lot from him. At the end of the day, this person who was the original breadwinner of the company, of the family, was not able to return to the company. And he died miserably inside his room because he was locked up by his own family members. Siguro because they're so spooked about the transformation. And then who would want to rear or to take care of a bug or a cockroach? And cockroach as an insect is not really the most elegant animal there is in the animal kingdom. It's an insect, and Franz Kafka had selected that as a symbolism of a very low value. Okay. Anyway, industry labor says a lot about our industrial revolutions. This can continue on to fourth industrial revolution when intellectual laborers are also exploited. This one is a scene from an illustration that I found online associated with a collection of short stories, cover illustration, or an artist's interpretation of the story or the collection. The Tikbalang is there, riding as a passenger, and other mythical creatures of local folklore. But what we notice is they are dwelling in the reality. The reality is so strong in this representation. If you remove all of those mythical creatures, you see nothing wrong or anomalous in the picture. But with them in the picture, there's something anomalous. That's the dynamics of magical realism. It has started as a literary tradition championed by the Latin American authors like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who wrote the A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. I think he also wrote the Love in Time of Cholera, the novel. He used magical realism to improve his narrative and to make it more interesting. He would invest more on fantastical elements, but not defeating the entire realistic agenda. There is a life story that is happening. The life of a person unfolds in the realistic space. However, suddenly there are things that occur that melded with reality that they're not that are not supposed to be there, like duende, tikbalang, and will mess up with the life of the person. It's interesting because of the fantastical creatures for one, and it is interesting on a second level because the life of a person or the village, for instance, had been transformed. Either the village had been given a more optimistic chance in life because these creatures would help them in their production, or there's a magical happening in the village that would improve the lifestyle of people. That's the excitement there. But in the end, there is a moral story, similar to Once Upon a Time and other kids' story in the television programs. They invest in fantastic elements, and well, people become. Um, but in the end, there's always a moral of the story. Maybe, for instance, a genie occurred, and they become more drawn to material things that the genie provides. You say, uh, not until such time when the genie disappears and they realize that they can no longer invest in material things. What they're left are the finer things in life, their family members and so on, and they realize that, but they would not realize that without the fantastical elements involved. In the very old man with enormous wings, it was Gabriel Garcia Marquez short story. This man with enormous wings seemed like an angel had been dropped, but there was no explanation provided into the village. He was caged by one family, and the family benefited from him by monetizing him. For every spectator, they're going to pay a price just to spectate on the unusual creature. This is the only fantastical element in that story, but the rest are very much similar to your realistic space. That's why it's called magical realism. In the opposite side, when you create a theme that is based on fantasy heavily, it will be a fantasy painting or a fantasy theme. But if it is based, if the reality is superseding the fantasy, then it's magical realism. But if you're going to study or to have a scholarship on magical realism in literature and in painting, you will really find that there is no definite definition. or that because of so many offshoots in the interpretation of magic realism in visual art, its essence now becomes fluid. For every time that there is an offshoot, some painters would define it in a little bit different ways, skewed to their interest. Like for example, Frida Kahlo used magical realism, but she did not claim that she did magical realism. Only the art historians and the art critics who examined her works and classified him accordingly. Um, she used surrealistic elements in her magical realism. She pointed out that this is a self-portrait and she's painting reality, according to her. But the version that she pursued were more not really adept with aesthetics, but more of the experience of physical pain and emotional grief or pain coming from depression. No matter how she would nourish her body, or no matter how the nurse would give her food, her body would no longer be able to go back to normal. She experienced paralysis because of an accident in a tram or a small train. Yes, she did not recover her walking or her mobility, but she could move on in the torso with support on her spine because her spine was also severed. She can move her arm to paint. That's why she was able to paint in this manner with an easel attached to her bed and the canvas, okay, hanging there or supported by the easel. She continued the personal take on personal journey on realism by painting specifically strange element, okay, and using surrealism. I'd like you to pay attention to this. This is a common picture of surrealism, just to remind you of how it looks like. It uses an illogical combination of objects, and landscape is very common in surrealist interpretation, similar to what I've shown you last time kaking sa ganito nga artist class. Si basta na ako gipakita ninyo nga surrealist painting, then there's also a desert, right? There's a desert and there are anomalous elements that appear, and sometimes some elements would be too different, okay, from the groupings or from the themes that occur. Melting clock, and there's one clock here being dominated by ants. At the background, you have landscape and water. I got this just a while ago, and this is a perfect example of magic realism. Everything looks normal on the shoreline, except for the strange. These are not yet too surreal, but these are strange elements, but are possible. Are possible. The piling up of rocks. The strange or even stranger elements are located in the background. You have the different varieties of, I mean, different intensities of waves. On the right side, you have waves that are almost like mountains. On the left side, you have waves that are seceding on the shoreline. But again, the feeling that this one is unusual makes it more magical realism. But if you're going to examine, some of the things here are possible. Some of the things here are possible. Still strange things on self-portrait of Frida Kahlo. This was really how she looks like. You have a single eyebrow. The strange element specifically is the thorn piercing her neck, as if on their own doing it to her. Then the indigenous elements are not strange. It may look strange to you because these are exoticism that she invested also in her paintings. The flora and fauna that she found in Mexico. On the second part of my discussion, these are the abstraction, and this will be quicker than realism because I'm just going to run through. Abstract organic looks like this. The only thing that belongs to figurative abstraction is distortion among the list. Anang distortion sa ikaapat nga bullet. Okay. So here is organic. It doesn't represent anything. It simplified the composition into 3 objects that are nameless because they're not recognizable, but they can associate with shapes like bean shape and other stuff without necessarily drawing meaning from the combination. Another is this one. Eves had used surrealist elements here. Her ribbons were actually deformed figures or biomorphic forms. They are organic. And this is under abstraction, okay? Another under abstraction is action painting by Paul Klee. There's also an action painting by Jackson Pollock, which is more aggressive and chaotic. He would lay flat on the floor, his canvas. He's going to step on the canvas to splatter paint, attuning to the rhythm of music that sometimes he imagined or sometimes playing in the background while lighting cigarette or smoking cigarette. Paul Klee is more subtle in his motion. He lets the line create that implied motion, the implied motion of the wave and the slight, gentle movement of the sailboat. I did a digital art my students did a digital art 2 sems ago.
Oh, yeah. Since you've gone, I've been lost without a trace. Dreaming that I can only see your face. Look around, but it's you I can't replace. I miss so cold and alone, alone in the rains. Keep crying, baby, baby, please.
Pero more or less, mao na to siya, modern version of action painting. You can imagine how extensive was the process of Jackson Pollock as well. Cubism, this was done by Vicente Manansala, centering on the values, Filipino values of getting together in a supper, which is very much rare in today's world because of the change construct of our lifestyle, that the siblings are working, but they do not get off from work on the same time. So they eat their dinner, they eat their supper alone. These are unavoidable. It happens to my family. It happens to any contemporary family. All right, as I was saying, this can be distinguished as a separate category. Para di maglibog, this belongs to figurative abstraction because distortion still is based on an apparent image. There's a reference to reality. But mind you, this one is a different expression from caricature. Caricature is a conventional, cartoonish representation, while distortion is more of an explorative medium in modern art. Joshua Cabrera, Cebuano artist. He calls himself conceptual artist man siguro. But ako ra gikuha yung work as an example for distortion. So don't be surprised that in exhibition they call it abstraction, even if you still see an apparent form. That's why I introduced the brand of abstraction called figurative abstraction. Kani usually makita ninyo sa mga pure composition ng exhibit. Another term for that pure composition is self-referential, just mirroring itself. Nothing more beyond the painting. Sa possibilities, you are reading, for instance, the artist statement, and you figured out that Piet Mondrian was inspired by Manhattan's busy street. So he created this painting. It seems like a top view, but not necessarily a top view of New York, Manhattan, depicting an alternating current of yellow, red, blue, the busyness of the city. This was also captured by Kiko Bordeos, who was able to reside in New York, but a Filipino. It's called abstraction possibilities because there's also a reference to, again, the grid traffic of or the grid roads of New York, Manhattan. Possibilities, you still have an apparent, not totally apparent. Sorry, I think that the term is reference. There's a referent or a reference form because you can sense that these are eyes that shed tears. This is a panel painting. However, it can still be considered as two-dimensional, although it has bordered towards the relief sculpture because of the gluing together colored panels or painted panels, just to recreate the experience of space while looking at a flat composition or supposed to be flat composition. Lastly, this is a gallery filled with lines. The entire experience now is being remodeled. When you enter the space, you don't know, you cannot figure out where to go. Unlike if you have a road, you know where to turn, where to go straight ahead. But in this case, you need to figure out your own space and your own path. It's crisscrossing, and these kind of placement of figures are not really attuned with your experience of reality. That makes it an extraordinary experience of space. But this is an offshoot of abstraction done in an installation way. I am done with my discussion.